Well, in conjunction with the National Department of Health, Business for South Africa is working to enhance the supply of medicines and resolve shortages by securing products from various suppliers. It's also looking at the economic impact of the lockdown through these models that we are looking at tonight. To discuss, we're joined by the head of the Economic Intervention Workgroup at Business for South Africa, Martin Kingston. Mr. Kingston, thank you very much. So basically, you're saying that we need to move very quickly towards a phased restarting of the economy. Do you want us to move to stage 3 as soon as possible?
Well, actually, we want to move through all the levels, in fact, to stage 2 and beyond to level 1 as quickly as possible, but with due regard to the need to preserve people's livelihoods and lives and health. And as you've already said earlier on in the program, we were already in a recession. That recession was compounded by downgrades to junk status. But COVID-19 presents a completely unprecedented set of challenges to our economy, to society, and most importantly, to people's health, to the nation's health indeed. And the likelihood of being able to recover from that in the immediate short term is very limited. So yes, we are saying that it was an absolutely necessary step. We supported government in the lockdown. That was to give us the ability to prepare, in particular, the front line of defense, the health workers, the health facilities, so that we can cope with what is going to be a very significant increase in the level of infection, people who need to be admitted to hospital, to ICU, and sadly, people who are going to die. And in that context, we think that we've bought ourselves some time, but now we need to return the economy to full activity as quickly as responsibly we can as a country.
So what is the time frame? I mean, do you want 3 now, 2 when? What sort of time frames are we talking about?
Well, in the final analysis, that is for government to decide. All we can do is partner with government and support them in very difficult decisions that have to be made. Most importantly, we need to respect the need to have appropriate protocols in place at work, in terms of transportation to and from work in public spaces. That means, of course, social distancing. It means face masks, health protocols that were announced by the Minister of Employment and Labour. Those need to be enforced, and they need to be enforced rigidly. We think that companies, actually large and small, can monitor the health of their workforce by ensuring that they are screened, tested, that we have tracking and tracing. We know that all of those are very helpful facilities in terms of limiting the spread of the infection and indeed of flattening the curve. But at the same time, we need to ensure that we can restore the economy to full activity as quickly as practically possible. Level 4, as has been promulgated at the beginning of this week, or has started with effect from the 1st of May, doesn't give us the kickstart that we need to the economy to ensure that we can avoid the level of contraction that you're talking about, the heightened risk of very significant additional unemployment. The only way we can do that is by moving through level 4 to 3 and 2 and ultimately 1 as quickly as possible, in full recognition of the fact that we need, as I said, to measure that against appropriate protective steps that we're taking to deal with the health challenges to society.
So Business for South Africa wants to be a feedback mechanism between business and government. Is government listening to you? It sounds like you're saying we simply cannot afford to stay in level 4 for much longer.
Well, I believe that government acknowledges that the private sector has an absolutely crucial role to play in powering the economy and feeding our people and ensuring that people are in gainful employment, and that we aspire to inclusive long-term growth, which unfortunately has eluded us over the past several years and is going to be severely damaged by COVID-19, as we've already discussed. We have been extremely heartened by the level of dialogue that has taken place with government. We have input in all of the steps of this process. The President engaged with us, as he has said, when he decided to apply the lockdown. That is absolutely the government's prerogative, but we supported that for the reasons that I've articulated. In terms of lifting the lockdown, we have given extensive input to government across many departments to ensure that they are aware of the challenges that are being faced both by sectors and individual businesses across the country, large and small. We've done the same thing, of course, with the Department of Health, as you had said earlier, the same thing with the Department of Employment and Labour, to ensure that appropriate provisions are put in place in respect of, for example, the temporary employment relief scheme. So, yes, I think that government is listening very carefully, just as we are listening to government, because we're aware of the fact that we have a common set of challenges if we're going to be able to navigate these very complex issues, preserving the nation's health, ensuring that there is no greater strain on society than there needs to be, and returning the economy to full activity as quickly as possible.
Talking about that return, I mean, it's all good and well to come out of lockdown, but what then? As economies are opening up overseas, commentators are asking, what if people start flying again, bring COVID again into vulnerable countries, the spread accelerates? What if things are even worse the second time around?
Well, that's obviously a risk that we need to consider. We haven't advocated lifting the lockdown with respect to cross-border travel at all. At the moment, transportation is simply to bring exports into or imports into the country, and particularly critical goods and supplies, medical supplies, but also to feed the economy in terms of imports that we require for essential goods and services. We're not suggesting that air travel should be permitted cross-border at all. We also need to recognise, of course, that it's anticipated that the rate of infection is going to increase and that we're not going to expect the surge or the peak until closer to the end of August or the beginning of September, at the very time when we will have reduced the level of lockdown, hopefully to one, well before that. So we're going to have to navigate those challenges in any event at that time. And we've got to come up with a model that works for South Africa, recognizing our particular and peculiar challenges as a country, so that we can ensure that we have maximum employment whilst maintaining, as I said, social distancing, the health protocols that are so important, and looking after the health and well-being of our country. In the final analysis, this is lives and livelihoods that we need to consider at the same time.
Yeah. Mr. Kingston, one of the big issues right now is tax revenue not coming in. And of course, you need that revenue to pay the social grants that are helping people survive this very lockdown. Any opinion on government's decision to stop the sale of liquor and cigarettes and the resultant tax revenue that would have brought in?
Well, we've made it clear that we're not going to lobby in respect of narrow sectoral interests, nor are we going to get involved in any litigation, because we've been asked that question. We can certainly see the advantages, certainly for the fiscus, of the sale of alcohol and of tobacco products. And those comments have been, and those motivations have been well advanced over the last couple of days. We again respect the decision of government in that regard. The Commissioner of the South African Revenue Services made it very clear when he made his statement earlier that we have a massive shortfall now in tax revenues that is anticipated, nearly 300 billion rand, and we're going to have to deal with this fiscal deficit. It was already anticipated, but nothing like the size that we're seeing now, and we need to be able to gather taxes from wheresoever we can, indeed, as you say, so that we can provide the social safety net that is needed for the most vulnerable in society, for the grants that are now being extended throughout the country.
Let's finally look at the economic models, which we brought up earlier, between 10% and around 17%. That's a contraction you're looking at this year. Were you alarmed at that, firstly? And I mean, we've got this massive stimulus package. Why is it not making a dent?
Well, I think we need to separate those two issues. In fact, our results, exactly as you said earlier on this program, are very similar to those of National Treasury. We have compared our inputs and our outputs. Our model is almost identical to theirs. It's an input-driven model across nearly 50 sectors of the economy. We anticipate in our base case that probably there'll be a contraction of something like 8.5% to 9%. The longer the lockdown endures, and of course we have to take into consideration the economic position of our trading and investment partners, they are all equally impacted on and challenged by COVID-19. The longer that endures, the worse the contraction will be, which is why we need to restart the economy as quickly as possible. The duration of that downturn in the economy is likely also to be protracted. In fact, National Treasury anticipate that it will endure until probably the end of 2021. We're in agreement with them in that respect. And we'll only start to see a recovery in 2022, all things being equal. And that recovery will be a slow recovery, and it needs to be predicated upon a fundamental restructuring of the economy, as the president himself and many of his ministers have said. So we're already working on that as a matter of urgency to see what shape the economy should take when we come out of a COVID-19 environment, recognizing we're doing so against a backdrop of a depression on the one hand and downgrades on the other hand.
Yeah. Well, my final question was, are we going beyond recession here towards depression? Is that possible if there's a prolonged lockdown?
Well, I think that whether we call it a recession or a depression, what we are looking at is a very significant long-term contraction in the economy. It's going to endure beyond this year into next year. It can only recover in a post-COVID-19 environment. And when it does, we're going to have to make sure that we're firing on all cylinders. You mentioned the fiscal support package. We very much appreciate and support the announcement by the president of the 500 billion. I would argue that that's an immediate support package to provide and alleviate the suffering for those who are, in fact, the most vulnerable in society, for small and medium-sized enterprises that are threatened, whose viability is very much at risk today. It's not going to be enough for the next 2 or 3 years. We'll have to wait for the budget, which will be tabled, I imagine, in the first half of this year, in the next couple of months by the Minister of Finance. And we'll be working as closely as we can with government to see what support can be provided by business to ensure that the level of fiscal deficit is as limited as possible under the circumstances.
All right, thank you. We appreciate your time tonight. That was Martin Kingston from Business for South Africa.